The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Please go ahead. Hi, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Good
Yeah.
morning, everyone. This is Margarita, and I'm with the Stanford Peace Innovation Lab. Want to present some of the work that we've been doing here in the lab. So let us get started. I apologize for the late start here. So, as I learn to drive GoToMeeting, we're going to talk a bit about what we do. Our lab draws on a variety of different disciplines. We were incubated out of the Persuasive Technology Lab at Stanford in the Human Sciences Technology Advanced Research Institute. So as a consequence, our lab is extremely multidisciplinary. We also spent time in the School of Engineering, in mechanical engineering, in the Center for Design Research. So we have a foot in engineering, a foot in behavioral psychology, and we also have an affiliation with the Graduate School of Business here. And that informs our work in terms of technology, human behavior and psychology, and also business models and how all those need to play together in order to catalyze the peace tech industry. So why now? Since 2007, we have entered into this era of mass interpersonal persuasion. And if you can remember what you were doing in 2006 and what changed in 2007, the big obvious changer was the iPhone. But in addition to that, in 2007, it was an interesting watershed year because it was the first time that we had large-scale analytics in the form of Google Analytics to be able to see people's behavior online. And at that time it was, what websites are they going to, how much time do they spend there, what is their city of origin, what is the technology that they're using, and so on. And needless to say, the amount of information that we're able to collect in terms of people's behavior online has only increased exponentially. And of course, the sensors that we have in place, from all the sensors on our smartphone to webcams to face recognition, everything else continues to create a highly instrumented environment to observe human behavior. The other thing that happened since 2007 significantly was, with these analytics and these sensors in place, was the ability to design and test behavior at scale, certainly with the advent of Facebook and Twitter. And our particular interest is looking at how you design pro-social behavior at scale. And then, of course, all that's been fueled by new business models that provide the incentives, the economic incentives to do this and to be able to do this at scale. And in 2019, this is no surprise to anyone, we need to wage digital peace because we've seen how technology has been weaponized against us in all different sectors. So in our lab, we have 3 pillars that we're working on. The first one is to establish a market signal for the value of peace. And we've done that, by creating this peace data standard. And we've talked to pension funds, family offices, institutional investors, fund managers, because the structural problem of how capital gets invested, and I'm a former venture capitalist, means that the things that we care about have to have a price on them. Otherwise, they're not investable. They are, it's the same thing that we see in the environment in terms of environmental quality, air quality, water quality. If you don't put a value on it, it will not be invested in, it will not be protected. Once we've gotten the capital markets interested in valuing peace and saying, okay, well, this is something that is we're willing to invest in, that we want to pay for, and so on, then they need to have a place to put that money in. So you need to create an industry. And we, part of our mission is to catalyze the peace tech industry. And then thirdly, in order to create that peace tech industry, you need to move upstream. And so at Stanford, we're certainly an engine of innovation and startups. What do we need to do to work with those students to cultivate them to go and create peace tech startups and technologies? Well, we need to give them frameworks and curriculum. and specifically around the ethical and safe deployment of emerging technologies and innovation, because I think it's clear to everyone now that any technology you put out there can and will be weaponized. There will be harm. And the days are long gone where engineers can just say, I just designed something, and what happens after that is not my concern. Engineers need to begin to take responsibility, especially in computer science, in terms of the potential harms and how to design their code to avoid that or certainly minimize it. So in support of those three pillars, we have three primary programs. The first is the Hague Peace Data Standard. We published a paper on that last year. I will talk about that later in this talk. The second is working on a peace engineering initiative that we're doing in collaboration with Drexel University, CU Boulder, University of New Mexico, and others. Yvonne, I see that you're on the webinar. We had a host of other schools come out to The Hague this summer to do a summer institute on peace engineering. And this was kicked off from the WEEF conference last November, where the theme was around peace engineering. And the third is to create a community of practice. And so we're launching a Peace Innovation Network, which is a membership program for entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, young people who want to design new technologies that have peaceful outcomes. So within our toolkit, within Peace Innovation, we use behavior design. Our mentor is BJ Fogg here at Stanford. He incubated this program. So our intellectual foundations are in behavior design, persuasive technology, which also came out of Stanford, and then looking at peace data. So those are the three primary tools. Of course, we have other things in our toolkit as well, like game design thinking. We also look at neuroscience research to support what we do. In our lab, our research question, if I was going to explain this to my mother, is how good can we be to each other? And it's a very simple question, but when we get into it, it's actually quite deep, because it is about how can we positively engage with people and organizations and entities that are different from us, and how can we do that in a way that's productive. So I'm going to tell you three stories. The first one is called Besties. In 2009, we worked with Facebook, back when Facebook was more of a good guy, let me tell you, on a project called Peace Dot. And this was while we were being incubated in persuasive technology. And we went to corporations and said, how much peace are you creating in the world? Can you quantify that in any way? And we went to companies in a variety of different sectors. Facebook was our flagship. And what they decided to do is say, okay, what are the distinct friending activities on a daily basis between communities across a significant difference boundary? So they looked at Israelis and Palestinians, Pakistanis and Indians, Ukrainians and Russians, different religions, political parties, and so on. And it was the first time you could actually get a number on this kind of behavior. And if you asked a person on the street, do you think Israelis and Palestinians make friends? Are there any friendships? And they go, oh no, my God, they're mortal enemies. They would never, ever, ever have any kind of, friendships. It's inconceivable. And yet within Facebook at the time, and we ran this experiment for a number of years, we could look at the data on a daily basis, the unique new friendships. And so the first time that we were able to quantify this a discrete positive behavior, which was this friending behavior. Fast forward a few years, we're still looking at the data, and there's Operation Pillar of Defense, which was in November of 2012, and we were looking at the unique new friendships that are made, and we were able to look at what was going on in that conflict, and the friending activity never went to zero. And in fact, if you looked at the total casualties, the number of friends that were made far exceeded the number of casualties. What the significance of this, we could leave that to political scientists to debate. But again, it gave us a way to quantify what was going on. And that gave us an early signal that If we started looking around, we might be able to find other data that would give us a sense of positive peace behaviors. The next story I have is called Play Nice. And in Play Nice, if we look at video game platforms, they are the tip of the spear in terms of what's possible in terms of online engagement. And a couple of years ago, Jeff Lynne, who was CXO at Blizzard, where they do League of Legends, he was noticing that there was a high levels of toxicity on the platform. And he said, well, is that our obligation? Do we need to do anything about it? And he decided that, yes, actually they did. And so he got together like a collection of 40 psychologists, and they started working on the platform, experimenting on different interventions that they could do to increase civil discourse, decrease harassment, bullying, and so on. And unlike a psychology experiment that you might run in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford, where you get 20 students and you pay them with a $35 Amazon card, and you get, yay, I have 30 subjects. With League of Legends, you have millions of players. And what was fascinating about it was that they could run hundreds and thousands of experiments, determining what different changes they could make on the platform to measurably reduce this kind of negative behavior. And they were able to demonstrate that it was possible. And that was quite powerful. By the way, in terms of video game platforms, something to note versus something like a Twitter, which also has similar negative social behavior, the business model in video games is not advertising based. So for video games, their economic incentives are in line with this, because if the environment is not convivial, if it's not pleasant to play the game, players stop playing, which seems pretty obvious. But what it means to their business model, their bottom line, is that then players will not subscribe to the game. They won't pay to continue to play. Unlike Twitter or a Facebook, where Twitter and Facebook don't make money off of you and me using the platform. They make money off of the advertising. Our behavior is largely immaterial to their advertising revenue. So in this case, they were extremely incentivized to do something about it. And as a consequence, last year, the Fair Play Alliance was announced at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco last spring, where a coalition of over 30 gaming companies came together to say, we're going to share research on best practices on player behavior. And so if we want to look at the leading edge of who's doing the most interesting work around how to foster pro-social behavior, I would look at the video game companies. Now, mind you, they have huge problems, but the fact that League of Legends was able to move the needle on some of these behaviors by up to 40% is significant nonetheless. The last story I'm going to tell you is called Strangers in the Night. And when we talk about pro-social behavior, we think, okay, if I could get millions of people to be hospitable to perfect strangers, what might that be worth? And I often ask this when I give keynotes, would you allow a perfect stranger in your home? And most people say no. And I say, well, if that perfect stranger paid you $50, would you do it? And people still say no. And I said, but if we could make this work, and we could do this at scale and get over the trust issues and get over all this, what's the possibility of that? And when we look at that, of course, this is, Airbnb. And with Airbnb, the key thing that they had to crack was the trust problem. How do we get people to trust each other? They were able to do this. This data is about 2 years old. Their valuation was 31 billion, 191 countries, and over half of the hosts are women. And that is significant, because women are very safety conscious. And yet, if they were able to if Airbnb was able to create a platform in such a manner that signaled that this was trustworthy and safe to women, that is significant. The other thing that's interesting about Airbnb is that they have become aware of the bias on their platform. And about 3 years ago, they started addressing this. And again, looking at the data, looking at the behavior data of the hosts, and then giving them feedback, letting them know that when they turn a potential guest down, what the loss in revenue is. And then, of course, they flag hosts that repeatedly do this, and then they remove them from the platform. So there's a way to look at this behavior and incentivize people to be good to each other. In addition to that, they are working on anti-bias training for all their hosts. And if you think about the footprint that Airbnb has across 191 countries, if they are able to make like a 10% improvement around these issues of bias across 191 countries, that potentially has more impact than any single piece of legislation you could write. So these are interesting times in terms of the power and potential of these technology platforms. Let's see. Next, when we talk about creating a market signal for the value of peace, what do we mean? So last year, we published a paper in the Frontiers in Psychology, creating this theoretical framework for using technology. And in this case, we looked at gender. We wanted to look at intergroup interactions. We focused on the case of an Australian bank where their employees were roughly 50-50 male-female. And we looked only at the metadata of their chat platform. So no linguistic analysis, nothing like that. It was just, we just wanted to look at the episodes of engagement between men and women. And just to get some baseline data of how they interact, the frequency, would we see what kind of gender patterns would be revealed just by looking at this metadata. And the opportunity of this is, how do we leverage the power of big data and machine learning to understand when and how technology facilitates peace and positivity. Certainly in the workplace and HR, it's a bit of a black box. People don't have good data to work with, and the interventions that are designed to deal with diversity or gender discrimination aren't terribly good. They tend to be, here, look at this PowerPoint, and now you're in compliance, but it doesn't fundamentally change people's behavior. And in order to change people's behavior, you need to be very specific. In this case, with this study, we were able to look at, person A, the sender, who's male, the difference boundary is gender. We could choose a difference boundary of language, ethnicity. It could be even their role. What's the interaction between engineers and marketing people and so on. The meeting technology in this case, we could look at Gmail and then the recipient, and we can begin to compute some economic value in terms of what those interactions might look like. In the case of the Australian bank, we were able to look at differences in terms of behaviors around networking, who pays attention to what, who responds, what is the latency, and so on. And we were able to also do some social network analysis in terms of the quality and density of those social networks. And we were able to see quantitatively that women have denser networks, and they are much better at cross collaboration. So then once you start looking at that, you can imagine the next step is building a dashboard, say in someone's communication software, and saying to someone, look, here's some key metrics. Joe, when you delay getting back to your female colleagues, this is the impact in terms of people's work streams. They can't move forward on something if you ignore them or you delay by 2 weeks, but you get back to your male colleagues within the day. We need you to improve these numbers. That gives people, Joe, positive, some very concrete feedback on what he needs to work on, and vice versa. So this application of Peace Data Standard was just fascinating in terms of what we could look at just looking at episodes of engagement. And when we think about collecting piece data, you know, in this case, it reveals these invisible relationships and dynamics. We can use the potential for using this kind of piece data is to look at how to improve the quality of life and health, and especially the social capital. And then again, you can determine the economic value of pro-social behaviors, of pro-social communication behaviors. And then ultimately, we see a path where companies can be rewarded for the piece they create. And that's where we see where it's going next. Finally, I want to touch on peace engineering in terms of designing safe and ethical technologies. It is we are in the early days of peace engineering, and as I mentioned earlier, any technology can be weaponized in a way its inventors did not intend. And certainly when we talk to our colleagues in the Department of Homeland Security, they've told us about how the major tech companies have been very good, for instance, reasonably good in terms of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism in terms of dealing with videos and harmful content. But what has happened is that those behaviors have been pushed down to smaller companies that are less resourced, and that may not even be aware that the technology platforms are being used in illicit ways. And so this is really about a call to arms to those software developers to make them aware and to put the detection into their platforms at the point of design. So that's one extreme case. And then the other is, you know, if we could go back into the time machine and talk to Jack Dorsey when he's developing Twitter, and they're saying, wouldn't it be great to create a platform where people could say anything they want, saying like, well, how do we put safeguards on that? So yes, we want people to have rich conversations online, but do we also want to create a platform where women can be harassed and receive death threats and so on? And he would probably say no, in which case we say, okay, how do we design this platform so we get the positive thing that we're looking for, which is rich discourse of conversation, and prevent or create a lot of friction to minimize the negative externalities that may emerge. And that requires awareness on the part of engineering and design teams that they don't currently have. But they also need some ethical guidelines in terms of how to do that, how to instrument their software so they're collecting the data so they can see it. Right now in this day and age, the way technology grows exponentially, people can respond only in a linear way. And so there's this gap, and mathematically, I don't know how you close that. I don't know how a straight line can ever catch up with an exponential curve. And that's the dilemma that YouTube and Facebook especially find themselves in, because they cannot throw enough resources, whether AI or human, to deal with the harms that are also created on their platform. So in terms of our philosophy of designing for safe and ethical deployment, again, you have to proactively detect unintended uses and consequences. You know, there's a whole world around AI and algorithms, and very good people at Stanford and all over the world are looking at how do we deal with bias, and that's going to be the next one of the next big harms. The other challenge that we have, of course, is how you establish data sets for good behavior for machine learning. So if you were, and we were familiar with the example with Microsoft when they put out their bot on Twitter, and within 24 hours, it was a hate and Nazi spewing bot that they had to shut down in embarrassment, because basically the bot learned from a data set of very bad behavior. And so when I talk to corporations as they do their digital transformation, saying, you know, be mindful of how you design your technology so you do elicit good behavior from your customers, so that way your machine learning can learn the proper, can have a good data set. And again, I'm reiterating this point, how do you design the safeguards concurrently with technology development rather than after the fact? I think that's one of the big takeaways of looking at what's happened with YouTube and Facebook in particular, that they did not put those safeguards in at the very beginning. Um, and it's an unmanageable problem now. So with that, I think for us in particular, we talk to students and we talk to corporations and we say, how can we create the world that we want? When we start from technology first or tool first, we run around and say, how can I apply this technology to do X, Y, Z? And I think we have it backwards. What we need to do is have a very rich and detailed imagination of the world that we want to live in, and then say, okay, in order to create that world, what kind of resources and tools do we need to do that? If we have that in mind, that will help us, that will become our North Star in terms of safe and ethical design. It will be our North Star in terms of business models that enhance human and plant quality of life, planet quality of life, rather than something that's exploitative. And with that, I want to end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The audience can type in their questions in the chat window.
I have left everyone stunned.
Dr. Mayo, you could ask your question verbally.
Okay. Margarita, hi, it's Elsie. So great to hear you again.
Yes, Elsie.
Hi. So the timing of this is perfect for me. On Tuesday, we are holding a webinar for investors and corporate leaders on looking at the other side of ESG risk, environmental, social, and governance risk, as an opportunity to open up streams of value.
Yes,
And
yes.
that's part of what you're talking about here, I think. I wonder if you could go back to what you said and what you and Mark have, and we've talked about before, which is the price signal for investors. Can you put a little more dimension around that? From the, as if you were either an investor listening to this explanation or the CEO of a major corporation.
So it's interesting because we've been working with some financial services groups in Europe, and what we're looking to do is, it's interesting because increasingly our work is overlapping with climate change because of the obvious peace and conflict implications of climate change, and we're drawing a thicker line between the two and saying, look, in 10 years' time, the world is going to be quite different. And it's interesting because companies worry about being disintermediated by some random startup, right? And so they go, there's some startup out there that's going to disintermediate us in our sector, whatever the sector is. It's going to be changed by that. And the big disintermediation, I think, is going to be climate, and whether because of political will or because of public will, a lot of companies are going to become obsolete because the carbon footprint is going to be the new currency that matters. And so when you look at whatever product or service that you create and you say, wow, my competitor, they're crushing us on carbon footprint. right? Because their carbon footprint is so much lower than what we're doing. We will be disintermediated by that. So fundamentally, I think every single industry, every single sector has to reimagine and kind of rebuild itself from the ground up. Startups, of course, can do that because they don't have any legacy, right? They don't have any legacy systems. They don't have any legacy. They're not bought into the past. That's why in the Valley we can create something new. It comes out of left field, and the incumbents never saw it coming, right? What happened with Nokia in terms of Apple and the entertainment industry in terms of MP3 and so on. I think that's going to continue. And so it's really about survival. It's about saying you've got to, for corporations, you really have to fundamentally reimagine what you do and how you do it. And you have to be able to demonstrate that it's not enough to say, I provide a service that's cheaper, because money is not, the cost of something is going to be a less salient metric compared to other things like carbon footprint. The other is that no matter what the future looks like, human needs still need to be met. You know, people still are going to have families. They're still going to be taking care of their sick in-laws. They still need to get their kids to school. Those things still are going to exist, but the way we get that done will be different. It will have adapted. And the smart money will invest in companies that can do that in that new context. Does that make sense?
Okay, thanks. I just unmuted. Okay, so yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is that the kind of the fundamental assumptions and dynamics of success for businesses will shift, or are shifting. And
Yes.
climate change is a driver of that, perhaps even more so than the threat of disruption from startups. Is there, can you talk a little bit about the price signal work that you and Mark and your team have been doing and how it relates to that?
So the way that some of the things, actually, I wish Mark was on the line because he could speak to it more, because he's lead on that. He's been working on developing peace finance products. And similar, sort of like, what would a peace bond look comparable to a green bond? And working with, again, financial institutions who have the dilemma of they have all this money that they have to put to work on impact. And, where their CEOs have made stated goals to support the UN's SDGs. And we're saying, that's great. How are you going to operationalize that? And so it's getting people to break out of the CSR box, because the CSR doesn't actually have any impact, but rather saying, like, you have to embed this in everything you do. But Mark is more qualified to speak about it than I am right now. So I will drop him a note to reach out to you, Elsie.
Okay, that's great. That's awesome. I'm really excited to hear about the peace bond.
Yeah.
Love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There are a few questions. Can you share your definition of peace? Is it absence of conflict or violent conflict, etc.?
No. So there are two in the field of peace and conflict studies. There are two types of peace. One is negative peace, and that is the minimization of conflict. And when people think about peace, that's traditionally what they think of, which is, oh, we need to go into this country and fight and restore order and so on. But Galtung in the 60s and 70s came up with a definition of positive peace. And there are a number of pillars to positive peace. We look at, and for most of us in the world, we live in a context of positive peace. And that is civil society institutions and so on, in terms of social stability, social fabric. When I think of positive peace and a positive peace investment, I think of a preschool, because you are investing in children and helping them develop their social and emotional skills so they can be functioning, thriving adults in the future. Positive peace is the pro-social interactions that we have. When I talk to corporations, I say, you know what positive peace is? I go, in your lingo, it's extraordinary customer experience. In your language, it is employee engagement, right? So we have different words, but we mean the same things, which is, how do we get, people to work well together? How do we get them to collaborate, cooperate? And that in our particular tiny slice of positive peace, we care very much about cooperation, collaboration, and value creation behaviors. Any kind of positive exchange between two people that creates more value is within our purview.
Thank you. Here's the next question. Let's do a scenario. I'm with a company that does not know anything about peace engineering. This is a mining and oil company. What arguments can I use for them to invest in peace engineering?
So it's interesting because we actually have someone, I'm a former petroleum engineer. So if you think about the oil and gas industry, so Shell Oil has an operation in Nigeria, and historically they've had a lot of conflict because the local people don't, they have issues with the oil and gas operations in the Niger River Delta. If Shell went in and said, okay, we want to go in with stakeholders, and how do we actually make this a win-win rather than something that's exploitative and extractive, right? How do we go in and the stakeholders say, look, when you come in and you do your operations, you come and you take and you pollute our water, and it affects our community's ability to thrive, and we didn't invite you in. Imagine if you could wave a magic wand and Shell said, okay, we're going to come in, we would like to do this, these are the conditions that we're going to do it in, and here are the guidelines and the limitations, which is we're not going to pollute your water, we're going to invest in your community, we are going to do this in a cooperative and collaborative way where our guideline is to not do harm to the local stakeholders and to the local environment. And how do we do that in a way that's measurable and demonstrable, right? And that third parties can audit and say, yes, indeed, when Shell came in, they didn't leave the place worse than what they found it. In fact, it was better, right? That would be an approach that, from a peace engineering, from an ethical standpoint, they could take.
How does this work relate to attracting more women into engineering?
It's interesting. When I was in venture capital in the 90s, where you saw the women was in life sciences. Okay, so the male VCs were in tech, but if you looked in the life sciences VCs, they were overwhelmingly female, and the reason given, and it's not like life sciences is any easier than engineering. Ask anyone who's ever taken organic chemistry, right? It's hard sciences, but they were attracted to it because they felt that they could positively impact people, right? So when, and this sounds somewhat stereotypical, and yet you look at behaviorally what happens, women are attracted to fields where they feel that it has some positive social impact. So we see the opportunity in peace engineering to attract a more diverse student body, and people who may not be, because we're saying, okay, engineers come in because they like to fiddle around and make things, right? And that is an end in and of itself. For many women, they may have the potential to get interested in engineering because it is a means for a larger goal that they have. And so that higher purpose, that larger goal, means that, like, oh, in order for me to accomplish this, I need to acquire this skill set, or I need to get this toolkit in order to do that. And so I think that peace engineering may be a path for women to have larger impact in the world by framing engineering and technical skills in a different light.
What do you mean by being able to measure peace with a high degree of granularity? Peace essentially being a political state of government and society. Is there any connection to well-being?
So again, when we're talking about positive peace, we're looking at the interactions between individuals. And so we have lots of data. We were talking to an enterprise software platform last year about how they might be able to use their HR product to measure gender and diversity engagement, similar to what we did with the Australian Bank and the case study in our paper. And they were intrigued by it because they had never thought about it that way, saying like, oh, we could actually provide meaningful behavioral feedback to the customers who use our software. And if they were able to do that in a way where they could measure improved gender engagement, for instance, and they turned that feature on, 450,000 of their corporate customers would then have that capability. So when we're looking at, there are people who look at peace in terms of a nation state standpoint, absolutely, and as political scientists spend a lot of time there. We're opening up a new dimension of peace work and peace research and peace innovation by looking at what opportunities technology offers, because the technology acts as a social actor between individuals. You and I are interacting through this piece of glass, which is my laptop, and we're talking to each other. There's a microphone that's augmenting my voice. I have earbuds that are augmenting my hearing. And the way we design those technologies and those interfaces will influence how we behave each other in unconscious ways. As we spend so much time communicating, interacting, collaborating, doing teamwork through technology, there's a huge opportunity for technology to move us in a better direction. And that's where most people are, is in the workplace. And I think that has been an area that's been overlooked. So it's a bit of a blue ocean. And I think there's quite a bit of opportunity to do meaningful research there.
Are you working in an engineering design framework that encourages safe and ethical technological development?
I certainly hope so. Yes. We're in its early days. I'm working with Gao Wang here at Stanford to develop a curriculum around ethical frameworks for our professional development program here at Stanford as well. So there's very much an imperative right now. Certainly living in Silicon Valley, there's certainly a tech backlash, but also sort of an existential moral crisis among a lot of tech leaders here of like, okay, what have we done and where do we go from here? And I'd like to think that our lab has a path for people who are stuck at that crossroads of, what have I done and where do I go from here, and say, here, come with us, we'll help you out of this. Well, let's walk toward a more positive outcome, and here are some baby steps that you can take to understand what you need to do, and let's co-create that together.
After collecting data and analysis, how do you follow up to measure the change that can be partly attributed to methods used?
So right now what we do is we work with corporations so that way they can follow up on that. And so one thing we don't do is we don't hold any data. So I want to make that clear, because that data is proprietary. There are all sorts of privacy issues around it. What we do is we work with these organizations and say, okay, now that we have this baseline data, what simple experiments could we do, a la what Jeff Lynne did with League of Legends, to change some of these behaviors. And that is something that is still in the early stages, because it takes quite a bit of time and a huge commitment on the part of the organization to do that. I will probably have more information on that a year from now, I will tell you.
I see that there are social and spiritual ethics, especially in a country like India. How can one integrate them in peace innovation in the professional world?
It's interesting because in Silicon Valley, we integrate our ethos all the time in an unconscious way. So Silicon Valley is very libertarian. And so that libertarian ethical framework is embedded in software, and people don't even know it. I think part of it is just having the conversation. One interesting thing to note is that was brought to my attention by Rosanna Guadagno, who was one of the co-authors of the Peace Data Standard paper, is the different codes of ethics in AI for autonomous vehicles. So depending upon the country of origin, there will be a different answer to the trolley problem. So I don't know if you're familiar with the trolley problem. It is a famous psychological experiment. It's been used gazillions of times. And basically the scenario is you're the engineer on a trolley and you see an accident that's going to happen, and you can take out a crowd of people, or you can take out a few people. Which do you choose? Right? And autonomous vehicles are always dealing with this trolley problem. We have a car lab here at Stanford where they're looking at the ethical issues of these things. And it turns out that if the AI for your autonomous vehicle comes out of Asia, they're going to make a different decision about if the autonomous vehicle sees a potential collision, who they're going to save and who is going to get killed, versus the autonomous vehicle coming from Germany or coming from Scandinavia. And so I thought that was very interesting, because can you imagine, at least in the United States, where we have all these different cars, do you want to be in the Mercedes-Benz when you're about to be in an accident because the Mercedes-Benz is going to prioritize the driver and the passengers over everyone else? Or do you want to be in a Kia that's going to prioritize the community over everyone else? Those things are actually happening right now. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question well, but it is a conundrum. And I think the key thing is to make those conversations explicit and saying, okay, in our code, these are the things that we value. How are we expressing that? And being very clear about it, versus I'm expressing my values in my code, but I'm not even aware that I'm doing it.
Hi there, excellent presentation. I'm writing from the contingency in Chile. If you have any ideas how to agilely support the policy terms to answer to the so widely requirements from population and contribute the so needed peace.
I'm sorry, could you rephrase that?
Let me see. I'm writing from the contingency in Chile. If you have any ideas how to agilely support the policy terms to answer the so wide requirements from population and contribute to the so needed peace.
Okay. I am actually looking for opportunities to work with policymakers. So a lot of our work has been sort of bottom up, looking at, given where we started 11, 12 years ago, looking at social media platforms and so on, and how they were changing behavior at scale. So you could look at how individuals could do that. And so we had the Facebook class of 2007, and students were creating all these tiny apps and watching them go viral, and as people did various things. I think that we need to bring policymakers up to date on the potential and perils of all these technologies, and help them get smarter and wiser about how to provide guidelines on all these technologies. And I think that, yes, I would love to work with policymakers on this. I don't have a pat answer on it, because this is something that we need to co-create. I don't want to come across as, hi, I'm Margarita from Silicon Valley and I'm here to save you, because I'm not. I have a lot of questions, and I'm looking for like-minded people, not people who are the same as me, but who have similar concerns with different points of view, and how we can have a very rich conversation that comes up with new tools and methods to move forward in this new world that we are in.
Considering differences between developed and developing countries, how do you see peace engineering achieved by both parties?
This is a very good question, and this is one that we've talked about since inception. The catalyst for peace engineering is Ramiro Jordan out of the University of New Mexico, and some of you may know him. He's originally from Bolivia, and he helped co-found IFES. This issue of how the developing world can embrace peace engineering is fundamental in the formation of peace engineering. And we part of what we did in The Hague was invite people from other schools, especially in Latin America, to get involved. and partially because that's where the network was in terms of our contacts and so on. And I've also had contact with universities in Beijing as well, who are interested. I think that it is you raising your hand and saying, okay, I want to be a part of this. How do I get involved in the conversation from the very beginning, to make it relevant? Because I think that ultimately, the people who are going to come up with the most innovative solutions are going to come from those places that have those problems, because they understand the context. There's so much more to solving a problem than just engineering ability. It's understanding the sociology, the culture, the mindset, the practices, the local economy, all of that. And that can only come from local expertise.
How would you respond to someone who argued that it is the nature of our modern day capitalism itself that prevents peace? In this context, is it realistic to use interventions rooted in capitalism to foster meaningful, lasting peace?
I think that we need to retool capitalism if we're going to solve our existential problems. I think that capitalism, certainly in the United States, as it is under the rules that we have in the United States, the capitalism and ROI have become toxic. You can have too much of anything, and you can have too much emphasis on profitability at the expense of everything else. I think that we have unintentionally created toxic business models out of Silicon Valley. And this is why our conversations with investors are so important, because they are at the top of the capital food chain. Venture capitalists get their money from pension funds and institutional investors. And they are given the mandate to say, like, you need to go and get me this, you need to get me a 35% return on investment. And so that's what they do. And they're successful at it. They're very good at it. If we want to see a different outcome, those institutional investors need to go to Sand Hill Road, to these venture capitalists, and say, look, I need to get a return on investment, of course. However, it can't be out of balance with these other things that I also care about, that I am also measuring. And that's, I think that impact investors, pension funds, and so on, don't realize the power they have to make positive change in capital markets. Because when they send that market signal of, I can't have return on investment at the expense of the environment, at the expense of humanity, at the expense of everything else, then they are complicit. They have to send that market signal. And then the venture capitalists will say, great, I'm going to create a fund because I want to raise a $500 million fund. And in order to get that fund, these institutional investors want me to do this. Fine, I will do that. And trust me, they will. They will do that. And that's why that signal has to come from the top. And that's how we'll begin to shift capitalism.
And the last question.
Not easy, but it's doable. Yeah.
The answer to many of contemporary questions in peace and happiness can be found in Vedic studies and Indian epics. Does any of your research group work to find any links between these epics and also other ancient civilizations?
We do not. However, one of the conversations that Mark and I have had is, how do we use the power of story and narrative to do this? It's not within our expertise, but we have recognized that stories and narrative have historically been some of the most powerful ways to move people to action. And we need to come up with, the stories and narratives that resonate with each community, to go back to each culture and say, what are your most powerful stories and how can they inform what you need to do in the future? I think that would be a fascinating intersection of our work and Indian stories.
Thank you so much for answering all the questions and for the presentation. If you have any last words.
I think you can see the slide. You can see where you can contact us. And then the prior slide is a contact form. So our lab manager will look at that and then be able to direct your inquiries accordingly. So we have a whole process. So the contact form is the preferred way for you to reach out to us. So that way we make sure that we catch it. And we have a whole CRM system set up. So we can track inquiries and follow-ups and everything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if anybody wants the recording, it will be posted on our site.
Thank you so much for your time and your attention.